All right, guys, so photosynthesis happens in two parts. What's the first part?
What?
What's the first part of photosynthesis? First step.
Wanting the light.
Light what?
Energy.
Yeah, but what's the name of the stage? Light dependent reactions. Light dependent. It's got to have light. And that light dependent stage of photosynthesis happens in the leaf mostly. And in what part of the cells in the leaf? What's the organelle where this happens?
Chlorophyll.
Chloroplast. So let's remind ourselves of what a chloroplast looks like here for a second. This is one single chloroplast. In a cell, in an average plant cell, there's a bunch of those. We just saw that in the previous video we watched, right? One plant cell has a bunch of these in there. But this chloroplast has inside it these little disc-shaped things. Those are called thylakoids. And that's where we find what? What's in the thylakoid?
Chlorophyll.
That's where the chlorophyll's at. It's embedded in the membrane, sort of like those channel proteins and receptor proteins we saw in the cell membrane picture. Chlorophyll's inside there. Chlorophyll's a protein, pigment. And I told you to think of chlorophyll sort of like what human invention? It's like a solar panel. It absorbs light and turns light energy into another form of energy. But what you need to know first, the light-dependent part of photosynthesis happens here at the thylakoid membrane, because that's where the chlorophyll's at. So know that first. A couple of other things that you just ought to know about a chloroplast. A stack of them is called a granum. And the space, the fluid that fills up the whole thing is called the stroma. Those words will come back up in a little while. What else have we talked about chloroplasts that's kind of unique? What do they have that they shouldn't have? We talk the same kinds of talk about mitochondria. They have their own what? They have their own little DNA. Single circular chromosome, like bacteria. They have their own ribosomes, separate from those of the rest of the cell. They can reproduce independently of the cell. We'll come back to that later, though. That's not important for right now. So, during the light-dependent part of photosynthesis, let's summarize what we talked about yesterday. This is kind of a diagram to show us how it works. This is one little thylakoid. So in the previous picture, we were looking at one chloroplast. Here we've zoomed in even further, and we're looking at just one of those little pancake-shaped thylakoids. Just one of them. One of the little discs. We're looking at just one. And these blue things are the proteins that are stuck in that membrane. A lot of these proteins are chlorophylls and other pigments that absorb light. So here's the thing. We've got two big groups of pigments called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. I want you to think of those again like the plant solar panels. They are taking in light. A normal solar panel will take light energy and convert it into what? Electrical energy. That sort of happens here. Because what's going to happen is those pigments are absorbing light. They're absorbing energy. What starts moving around inside those atoms of the pigments? What particles? What particles start to vibrate inside these photosystems? No, not yet. The electrons. Some people did, some didn't. The electrons start to move really fast until eventually these things absorb so much energy that what happens with some of those electrons? They shoot out. They leave. They escape. And those electrons move in sort of a chain-like pattern from photosystem 2 over to photosystem 1. And the one that left photosystem 1, it ends up attaching out here in the stroma, the fluid-filled space, with another chemical called NADP+. What are those electrons carrying with them, though? Energy, because what made them move? Energy from where? The sun. So when this electron right in here combines with this NAD+, it adds energy to it. And the NADP plus the electron ends up giving us this thing. Turns out to be important. I want you to think of that like a charged up battery, a chemical battery. That's one of the first things that's made during photosynthesis. It's basically stored sun energy, NADPH. Now, at the same time that's going on, remember that photosystem 2 over here lost an electron, and its electron's hopping across this little chain. While that electron's moving, it's used to power active transport. And these little proteins in here pump hydrogen ions, H pluses, into the thylakoid. If it's active transport, which way are they pumping them?
What?
Active transport, which way are they pumping things?
Against the grid?
Against the gradient, low to high. Is that the way H pluses want to go?
No.
No. Those H pluses that are in that little thylakoid want to do what?
Leave.
They want to get out. Why can't they? They're H what?
Positive.
Pluses. What do we know about pluses and phospholipid membranes? They don't like each other. So they're stuck. But the more H pluses that get pumped in, the more those want to get out. And I showed you yesterday that it's sort of like doing what? What did I compare this to? You guys remember what I compared it to yesterday?
Pressure?
What did I shoot across the room yesterday?
Rubber band.
Rubber band. It's sort of like stretching a rubber band, because the more H pluses you pump in here, the more what is stored inside that thylakoid.
Potential energy.
The more potential energy. They want to get out. And eventually they will. We'll come back to that in a second. So we're building up H pluses, building up energy inside the thylakoid. Before we get to that though, photosystem 2 lost some electrons. It needs to get them back. Where does it get electrons back from? It rips apart water. Stealing electrons from water. And what's left from a ripped apart dead water molecule? Oxygen and H pluses, right? So that builds up even more H pluses in there. But the oxygen is the oxygen that you actually breathe, right? Water gets ripped apart, oxygen is released from that plant, and that's the oxygen that you breathe. So that's the second thing that we want to remember that gets made in the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis, oxygen gas. So far we got NADPH, oxygen gas. The third thing, eventually there's a channel down here called ATP synthase. Should be pretty obvious what that does. Synthesizes ATP. But to synthesize ATP, what do you got to have? What's ATP all about? Energy. And the energy to make it has to come from somewhere. What's going to happen is these H pluses rush out through this little channel. And yesterday I compared this little channel to what kind of human machine? What did I compare the way this channel works to yesterday? Anybody remember? Yeah, like a little wheel underneath a waterfall. That as the water falls, it turns the wheel, and the wheel's probably hooked up to what? A generator that makes energy. Same kind of thing here. The H pluses rush out. There's a little mechanism in there that sort of turns because of it, and it's able to use that energy of those moving hydrogens to make ATP. That's the third product. You need to know 3 or 4 things for sure about the light-dependent reactions. First of all, they have to happen first. They have to happen in the light. They happen where? Where are we looking at here? What is this? The thylakoid membrane. And they make 3 main things. Oxygen gas, NADPH, and ATP. Both of these things are forms of what? NADPH and ATP are both forms of what? Stored chemical energy that's going to get used later to help us make what? To help the plant make what?
Food.
Sugar. Why don't they just use these forms of energy instead of making them into sugar?
Because I have to go standing stores and all.
These 2 things are unstable. You can't store them. Most all photosynthesis happens where in a plant? What part of the plant? The leaves. Well, the stems need food. The roots need food. So they have to convert the energy into some form that the rest of the plant can get, that they can send to it. These can't be stored very well. They're really reactive. So that's the light-dependent part of photosynthesis. Happens first. Happens at the thylakoid membrane. Makes oxygen gas, ATP, and NADPH. The last 2 of those are forms of stored energy that later the plant's going to use to make some sugar, some glucose. Oxygen gas, O2. All right, so let's go to the other part of photosynthesis real quick. The second stage, and I'm going to completely oversimplify here, but the second stage of photosynthesis is called sometimes the light what? Light independent stage, but most people call it what?
The dark something.
No, most people call it the Calvin cycle. It's named after the guy who figured out how it works. That's what I'm going to usually call it, the Calvin cycle. That's step 2. And as you can see from this diagram, the Calvin cycle can be pretty complicated. You don't need to know all this for terms of just intro biology, and that's great. What you need to know is this, that to do the Calvin cycle, the plants first need what gas?
Carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. And how does the carbon dioxide get into the plant in the first place? What are the little breathing holes on the bottom of the leaves called? Stomates. Stomates or stomata. Some people say stomata. Stomates, stomata. The plant breathes in that CO2. It's then going to take that CO2, which we see up here in the diagram, and essentially, what's it going to add to that CO2? What do we make in the first part of photosynthesis?
Hydrogen.
How about some ATP and some NADPH? So essentially what's going to happen in the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle is the better way to say it, the plant's going to take carbon dioxide, and it's going to use the ATP and the NADPH it made in the first part of photosynthesis, essentially to charge that up. It's also going to add in some hydrogens. If you add some CO2 and some energy and some hydrogens together, and you're a plant, what are you going to end up with?
Glucose.
Glucose. And that's essentially all I'm going to require you to know about the Calvin cycle for right now, is that during it, the plant takes CO2 in through its stomata, it adds in the ATP and the NADPH that it made in the first part, the light dependent part, and also some hydrogens, and it ends up making glucose, or maybe some other forms of sugar, but mostly glucose. One other thing to know about the Calvin cycle, it happens where? Where does it take place?
In
The stroma, which is the fluid-filled part of what? The chloroplast. That's the Calvin cycle. And that's where we're going to kind of leave this for right now. Question?
what is NADPH?
What does it stand for? Nicotinamide diphenyl something. I can't. You don't need to know. Just think of it as a charged up battery. All right, I'm going to stop there for a second with a recording.